Hello and welcome to another episode of the djproject Criterion Collection. And here we're going to talk about Spine 216, The Rules of the Game, directed by Jean Renoir, 1939. Okay, very brief, a little bit of Criterion Edition history. As you can see, this looks a little bit different. This was initially released on DVD in 2004, and this is actually the first initial pressing run, because it has this kind of neat. And there was another subsequent pressing. I think it came out in 2007 or so, where that translucent case was dropped, and then it was simplified. And to conform to the new Criterion cover designs. And then it got reissued on Blu-ray in 2011, I believe. And there's a completely new cover artwork there as well. Same thing for the DVD. Not much difference, I believe, in the transfers, though. So I think this is a case of just making sure that the DVDs now conform to the Blu-rays. And I don't think there was anything too radical, because this film definitely has a very interesting production history. This was actually Renoir's first independent feature. He wasn't making it for the studios. In fact, he and his brother formed their own production company called Nouvelles Editions Françaises, NEF. And the whole idea, it's a similar idea to United Artists. It was a company that would basically allow Renoir to make the kind of films he wanted in the way that he wanted to. So he had this idea. Well, actually, I'll get into the story and style a little bit. But basically, Rules of the Game was the film he wanted to make, and it went through a few production hiccups, including going over schedule and grossly over budget. Then it played in Paris in July 1939, just mere months before the Blitzkrieg on Poland, and thus starting World War II. And boy, oh boy, was there. Parisian reactions to things are always fascinating, because they're always taken to such an nth degree. There was rioting during the premiere of The Rite of Spring, which had more to do with the dancing than it did for the music, although I think the music didn't help that much either. And this one also had some intense derisions. In fact, the most famous anecdote is that somebody went into the theater with a newspaper, and as the film was playing, he set this newspaper on fire with the intent of setting the theater on fire. So if you get that kind of reaction, you know that either that could be really, really good or really, really bad, depending on who you are, I guess. I guess if you're a marketer, you go, ooh, free publicity. Remember, there's no such thing as bad publicity. But anyways, and it was originally premiered at 91 minutes. And then what Renoir did, he went into the theater and he figured out which scenes had the loudest catcalls and boos. And he figured out that was the scene that he needed to cut. So then he reduced it down to 84 minutes. But because of the strong reactions, because of the continuing negative reactions, it was eventually pulled off and was put in the vault. Then the original negative got destroyed over the course of World War II, and so it was thought that, okay, well, that's the end of that. But there were a few 84-minute and 91-minute prints still lingering around. So pretty much everything that we have in regards to the rules of the game came from prints. Then enter 1959, where two preservationists, one of them is preservationist, the other is an editor, I believe, made it their mission to gather as much footage as they could in regards to rules of the game. And this is where it gets a little bit confusing. I'm not sure, because they were able to source it from the various prints that were there, but they also managed to have scenes that were not included in either version. So I don't know how they were able to obtain, if supposedly the original negative was destroyed, how were they able to obtain the extraneous footage? My guess is that it was probably housed elsewhere and they were able to get that. It's not entirely clear how that came about. And I'm sure that there is material on the DVD itself. I haven't dug, it's been a while since I've dug deep into the supplements, so maybe that will probably shed some light. But basically, in 1959, they were able to reconstruct Rules of the Game to a length of 106 minutes. So 15 minutes longer than the initial theatrical release that Renoir put out. And this premiered at the 1959 Venice Film Festival, and it got lots of rave reviews. It was in number 10 at the first Sight and Sound poll of top 10 films. It was at number 10, and it then jumped to number. It then jumped to number 3 in. Wait, they started doing it in. Yeah, they started doing it in 62. It first appeared on there, and then in 72 it went to number 3, and then in 72, 82, 92, and I think 2002 it was at number 2. But it's in that list, you know. So if you've ever heard Citizen Kane, Vertigo, Tokyo Story's director's poll, but anyway, so it's in those films that get circulated in that poll, and it's. So therefore, it's considered one of the greatest films of all time. And I would agree with this. So, okay. So what is this film about? Well, first off, I'll talk about it stylistically because it's the easiest one to. It's fairly easy to sum up. At the point that Renoir had in his career, well, before that, he was known for naturalism. And this could be seen in La Grande Illusion and also La Bête Humaine, which I have not seen. So I couldn't say so for sure for what that was. But his big thing was naturalism. I presume that meant was having more instead of following a contrived storyline or following dramatic conventions. This plays a little bit more to real life. Not on the level of, say, cinema verite that Jean Roche would later do, but it's kind of on its way. But in 1938, when he started working on this, he wanted to go back to something a little bit more formal. He was reading a lot. He was reading Marivaux, and also, Marivaux was the location. No, Moyer. He also read de Musset and Beaumarchais. In fact, the film's epigraph is a section of The Marriage of Figaro. So going back to dramas and trying to do something a little bit more formal and dramatic and away from naturalism. I guess he was just looking for just another form to play with. And that was kind of his starting point. The other starting point was that he felt that he wanted to say something about the bourgeois of his day, and how in the introduction he would give 20 years later to the film a class that's rotten to its core. But he also noticed that it doesn't wear a mask. It's very frank and honest. It's honest with itself. It's almost as if you can see the corruption. There's no falsity. There's no disguise in it. So that's what he set out to make. So the story it starts with the arrival of André Giroux, who had just flown solo across the Atlantic. Yes, this was a feat first done by Charles Lindbergh, and he beat his record and several others. And so he arrives at France as a national hero. But he also says on the radio that he did this all for a woman named Christine, who's a um, from Austria originally, but she's an aristocrat. He did this all for her. He's not there. He's of course upset, and of course he vents his frustration in public, and this causes a little bit of social scandals, like how, you know, and so forth. This eventually leads into some attempts to reconcile and to try to patch things up, and the way that this was further done was Andre is invited to Christine and her husband and all of his aristocrat, because he's also an aristocrat, Marquis. Anyways, they go over to his chateau in, I believe it's supposed to take place in northern France, as I remember where the locations were in the geography and such. So they go up to northern France for a weekend of hunting and all the other stuff that you can do in a chateau. And then it turns into this very interesting, you know, comedy / tragedy. Well, the big thing that happens is that Christine wants to run off with different men. There's a point where she wants to run off with Andre after this is after she finds out earlier in the day that her husband Robert was having an affair with Genevieve. So you can kind of see where this could lead. So to make a really long story short, through a combination of other feuds that went on and other feelings that come into play, and the big one, mistaken identity, there is bloodshed, and it is brushed aside as an accident. And this is supposed to be probably the biggest reveal of the corruption and the immorality of the bourgeois morality, where it's basically it's the golden rule. Whoever has the gold makes the rules. And this is what Renoir wanted to showcase in his own way, but still make it a very entertaining film. And this also explains the negative reaction, which if you think about it, for a nation that prided itself on being founded on revolutionary ideals, they're very, very protective of their own social institutions that reportedly create a lot of disparity and wide gulfs. And actually in the 30s, it really was, in a way kind of a return to the pre-revolution, and in terms of the social standings. I'll get into it a little bit when I will later talk about Diary of a Country Priest, because it's also set around that same time frame. So this explains the derision, and then of course you can see how this will turn into praise, because it's very fun to criticize anything socially. Now, I think it's dangerous because this is very much European bourgeois. I think that's the big the dangerous assumption one can make is that when you talk about the bourgeois, it's pretty universal. That, you know, the bourgeois that you find in France is the same as the bourgeois you find in the United States. That's not necessarily true, and here's why. In Europe, there's a lot more stratification between the classes. Those who have property and wealth, and those who don't. I mean, it's very the dividing lines are between the classes is very clear, and there's not a whole lot of mobility going on. In fact, that's actually the thing you get from looking at Andre, is that he becomes this overnight sensation and this national hero by flying solo across the Atlantic and breaking a lot of records and so on. But beforehand, people didn't really care. It's because he did this extraordinary thing that he gets a lot of attention. But because he because this fame is thrust upon him, he now finds himself in a situation where, and especially with falling in love with Christine, who herself is an aristocrat. And it's pointed out a lot of times that, oh, Madame needs a lot of things. And how can you possibly provide for her? In other words, she's so self-absorbed in her materialistic. In fact, the first time you see her, you kind of know right off the bat that she's not really worth pining for. I mean, there's a lot better women that you could probably pine for besides her. I don't know what's the fascination. But at any rate, so one of the things that's revealed with this sudden fame is his limits, and that's due to his background. He hasn't spent a weekend in a chateau. He has not been on a hunting excursion, and that's a very interesting sequence. The whole hunting scene, and an example of animal cruelty where you think there is no animal cruelty, or the everything that happens is actually done for real. But anyway, so he's never been on a hunting expedition. He's never been on a masquerade ball. He's never had to deal with any of these customs because, well, he's not bourgeois. He's certainly not an aristocrat. This is an aristocrat who flew solo. This is someone who really had a passion and desire, and I'm sure not just for the sake of Christine. I think he really wanted to do it anyway. And so he set out to do it. So anyway, my point is that with European society, the classes are very, very stratified. It's very clear, like who's on top and who's on bottom. Whereas in America, there is, although I think it's changing now, which is quite depressing to think about, there is social mobility, or at the very least, there was social mobility. I don't know if it's around now, but there isn't that so much of that stratification. There's stratifications in other respects, but not so much about economic standing. Just because you were in a poorer situation does not necessarily mean that you will stay in a poorer situation. If you want to go beyond your station, it is possible to do so with hard work, with industry, ingenuity, innovation, a little bit of luck, and all those things. Now, yes, there are stratifications in other respects, but not so much on that. Now, that said, it is possible to look at this as a relevant social critique. Just understand that there's probably some different. What a Frenchman that wants to start the theater on fire is going to react differently than someone who watched it many, many years later, and certainly someone who's watched it in America. So in other words, that what the problems you'll see from this that you can see in the story are not necessarily the way you see it is not necessarily the same that you see it in the past. So and there are some things, and basically there are some things that one has to note and one has to keep in mind. And so it's a really good social critique. But there's another reason why it's considered one of the greatest films of all time, and it is the craftsmanship. This is one of the great examples, certainly one of the great earliest examples of deep focus photography, where instead of where it used to be, or I should say that in the beginning, it was thought of that the frame, that what happens in the frame should be focused on a particular action. So if you have two characters, the framing should be mainly on those two characters. Maybe it's a little bit wider so you get a sense of the space, and especially if somebody else comes in. But basically it's all focused on the action, and it's whatever the director wants you to see, that's what it is. Whereas deep focus permits it so that, actually technically deep focus means that what you see in the photography is in the foreground and the background. There's really no difference, and that all has to do with the nature of lenses and focal lengths. If an object is in a certain distance from the lens, it is more in focus than when it's further away. And that's called soft focus. But deep focus means that more where the background is just as in focus as in the foreground. Maybe a little bit, maybe slightly softer, but you can still see activity going on. It's not, in other words, if some characters are doing something in the back of the room there, and some characters are doing something in the front of the room, you can see both of them fairly equally because they are both more or less in focus. That's deep focus, and this is something that Renoir employs in this film especially, and this is something that carries on into subsequent films, most famously in Citizen Kane. In fact, Rules of the Game, I would say Rules of the Game and Citizen Kane, and maybe like one or two other films, are often used in intro to film studies classes as a way of learning the vocabulary of film, so that you know what the shot scales are, you know the difference between a still shot or a shot that's just shot from a tripod, a lockdown shot, and a tracking shot or a dolly shot or a crane shot, or you learn something about angles. This film is used as a really good example. And the one shot that stands out to me, because this is something that I actually saw when I took a little tutorial course while I was at William & Mary because I had taken a film studies seminar, and it was suggested that I take this course if I didn't go through any kind of film studies, just to learn the vocabulary. It was like a very, very short crash course in film studies, and so you learn pretty much all the vocabulary that you need to know in looking at a film. But anyways, we were talking about mise en scène, which is basically the things within the frame. Any props and decor, anything that's not related to acting but that you see within the frame is mise en scène. But I believe it was about mise en scène. Maybe it was about cinematography. I'm not sure. Anyways, but we did see a shot from Rules of the Game, and it was when Andre first arrives at the chateau, and he's then introduced by everybody. Like, all these people start coming at him, and they say, "Oh wow, you're Andre, you're the pilot. Oh, you're such a hero, and can I have your autograph?" And he's just faced with it's like this quick and dirty introduction to everybody that's there, and it's all done in a long shot, and where you see Andre and then everybody just coming in, and it's just this interesting dance of characters where one character comes in and then another character comes out, and there's no cuts. It's just this single shot that lasts for about, I would say, 45 seconds or so, maybe 30, 40 seconds, I think. But it's just these characters that are coming in and out. Whereas now you would think that, you would just have, but I think it would be impossible to do like lots of quick cuts and where you see all these single shots and everything. Plus that's not really effective. But the fact that it's all done in this long shot where you see their full bodies, it's not just their faces. You see their full bodies, and you get a sense of the room that he's in. You get a sense of just the people interacting in the room, and then near the end of this dance, it's the women that would like to kiss him as a way of offering congratulations and so on. And then it cuts to a close-up of Christine, who says that I would also like to do so, and she walks to him and kisses them as well. So of course there's a bit of a double meaning there, since there's also a love confession involved as well. So that's whenever I think of Rules of the Game, I think about that shot because of how I played in film studies class. So it really is now going back to what I said that for Renoir he wanted to go lean more towards a more formalist presentation as opposed to naturalist. The interesting result is by him exploring those French dramatists that provided the basis of the story. In fact, it's not. This is more or less an original story, but a lot of plot elements can be traced back to other sources. I mentioned de Musset's. In fact, originally he thought of doing an adaptation of de Musset's Le Caprice de Marianne, which was a comedy of manners, but then it started to evolve into its own thing. And he also read Moyet and Bachaumont at this time, and so those elements went into the story. So on the one hand, I think it's through and through an original, but it definitely has its traces elsewhere. But like I said, artists stand on the shoulders of giants. So, but anyways, so even though he wanted to be more formalist in this film, he ended up doing something that was kind of an interesting meet of what he was doing before with his naturalistic tendencies and formal. In other words, where it's basic, and actually this is something that I've come to like myself, or I've come to understand myself in viewing films, that when you tell a story, especially when you tell a story in film, it's automatically a contrivance. Because what you're doing is you are setting up a sequence of events that should follow each other. Whereas if you know in real life, events play out in all kinds of various configurations. You can, and even in something with a routine, there's always going to be some little variation. You can, like if you go to work every day, there could be one day you get stuck in a traffic jam because there was an accident several miles down the road, or your tire can blow out, or there's little things that can cause some variation. And so, but when you tell a story, you are setting up that this event follows this event, this follows that event, and that while it may have happened in some other past, you're creating characters and you're putting them in a setting that they would nevertheless have existed prior. So that already is a contrivance, and giving it structure and form, there's a bit of an artifice to it as well. But it does not necessarily mean that it can't lack anything real or natural in terms of, like, say, the characters. Have the characters present a kind of authenticity. And I've said this before, that my litmus test that I've thought of as far as the realism of a character is if you can imagine them riding with you on the bus or the subway or any kind of, or if you can imagine them in a public setting and they can still be themselves as if they were in the story, but they can also exist outside of the story in a more realistic environment. And this, I think, this I believe is Renoir's great gift to the whole world of cinema, is having that you can't have that balance between something that feels very real and authentic, but at the same time can follow a dramatic convention. And I guess I'll kind of close with, and yeah, this is one of those films you can probably go on and on about, but I would say, okay, okay. I told you there's a few more stuff I can come up with. I should have said this earlier with the critique of the bourgeois. Something that I noticed watching this again is that while there is a realism to the characters, you can also feel the satire, which again explains why you had this strong reaction on its initial release. It's not to say, but interestingly, it doesn't feel, they don't feel flat. I guess this is what I mean by striking that balance between something that's very formal and something that's very natural. Yes, there is a satire to this. Yes, there is a critique that's being made as the story unfolds. But you don't get the feeling that the characters are just merely exist as ciphers, or that they're just done for the sake of making a critique. That their actions and their characters feel very genuine, and this is actually what makes it very, very powerful. If it was a straight through critique, if it was made in a very contrived manner, it would have ended up being, it wouldn't have made the kind of provocation, it wouldn't have caused the reactions that it did in 1939. Of course, it didn't help that the threat of war was looming, and it was a very tense time anyway, but it's because of the naturalism of the characters and how the characters felt very real. It wasn't just that, oh, this is somebody that's exposing the ills of our society. This feels very genuine, considering that none of these characters exist. These are characters played by actors, but they still feel very, very genuine, and it's because of this you get that kind of reaction. And I think that's what makes it so interesting. So in other words, if it was just strictly a satire, it wouldn't have had this kind of provocation, and very likely it would have had a very limited appeal, which would have ended up merely just preaching to the choir, those who knew that there was knew that the bourgeois was rotten, and then everybody else was like, oh, it's just this little film made by those kids, and not much attention would be paid to it. But because of this, because of the story itself exudes naturalism, and Renoir did make this. He wanted it to be an entertaining film. He didn't want it to. He also wanted it to do other things as well, but he also wanted it to be entertaining, just like any other film that was made at that time, and certainly before that time. So really, it was no different than someone making Metropolis, or The Birth of a Nation, or Napoleon, or The Passion of Joan of Arc. Just something that anybody can enjoy. He didn't set out to make an avant-garde film where he wanted to challenge the conventions and maybe end up alienating the audience. But that was not his intention at all. So, but yeah, I can definitely feel the satire of it. But I think because it's portrayed so naturally, that there is, it makes it even more. The critique comes out very strongly. In fact, I would say that you can get from this film a kind of discreet charm about the bourgeoisie, especially at the very, very end, where the death is just declared as an accident, and it's, even though it was through and through murder, more in the, not first degree, more like second degree, but murder nonetheless. But it was then brushed off as an accident. Why? Because he's the Marquis, and he can say that. But I would wrap this all up. Sorry for going on all these various little tangents, but I'm going to wrap up by saying that as far as the first generation or two of filmmakers, the earliest filmmakers, basically films made before World War II, I would say that you can learn structure from Griffith, you can learn atmosphere from Murnau and Lahn, and I'm sure there are other German expressionists as well. You can learn about soul from Dreyer. And let's just say that Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton and Harry Lloyd are all givens as far as laughs. But okay, so structure from Griffith, atmosphere from Murnau and Lang, soul from Dreyer. And finally, what you learn from Renoir is how real moments play out in space. And that is why Renoir is so important. Something that I didn't really get into in discussing when I was discussing Grand Illusion. It definitely comes through in the rules of the game. And because of this, I highly, highly recommend this. If you care about film at all, if you want to have a really good foundation of cinema, this is one of those titles that you just need to have on your shelf. It looks great, and it looks as good as it's going to be because because this was based on the 1959 reconstruction using whatever available prints, and there's only so much you can do to make it as good as you can. But it still looks great. It's it plays well, and it doesn't have the major problems like say the Honeymoon Killers does. But it's definitely worth having on your shelf. I would say I would go that far. If it's almost like having Citizen Kane and Casablanca on your shelf. That it's just something that you need to have, and Rules of the Game is definitely in that category. So there you go, the Rules of the Game. And until next time, take care.